By the 1600s, Sweden was no longer a small, irrelevant kingdom. The internal power struggles of the Swedish nobility were over, and the Finnish peasant revolts crushed. The neighboring realms around the Baltic Sea, Russia, Poland, Lithuania, and the Holy Roman Empire, however, were still eagerly playing the Games of Thrones which Sweden had already finished. Taking advantage of this, Sweden rose to be a great power in Europe in the 17th century, often called the Swedish Empire. And it is this period which we will cover in this episode. Welcome. The beginning of this era started in 1611 with the 16-year-old King Gustav Adolf rising to the throne. His and his successors' continuous reforms to both the administration and military made Sweden a formidable realm among European powers, despite the small population and backwoods location. What did this mean for the Finns then? Well, they were arguably largely neglected when it came to the reforms, although the period of Per Brahe the Younger is often seen favorably, so who knows. On the other hand, they did get to enjoy more of their peace and precious personal space for a century, as the wars were fought on foreign soil, sparing their homes from constant destruction for a change. Some of these people could include the Ampiainen family. Ampiainen meaning shooter or marksman, not a wasp. And as it happens, these people are my ancestors that I've managed to trace back in time. I have again partnered with MyHeritage. If you remember from previous videos, I discovered a branch of my family tree going back hundreds of years. And would you look at that? There we have another branch going all the way back to the period of the Swedish Empire. Interestingly, this branch of the family has records starting from Viborg, Karelia, from where they moved to what is today's Sweden and finally settling in Norway and adopting an additional last name Hammar, meaning hammer if I am not mistaken. Why I think this is really cool is because I had no idea of my family history before my great-grandparents, and by adding them to the family tree, it automatically suggests matches and results based on over 19 billion historical documents. These can be, for example, parish registers, which in Finland can easily reach as far as the 1600s, so great for finding ancestors during the Swedish Empire. A handy feature is instant discoveries, where it gives you proposed matches that you can then review and add to the tree with a click of a button. And here it gave me an old photo of an ancestor, which we can then repair, colorize and animate. And the results are pretty good, especially considering that it took no time at all. Hopefully that gave you an idea of how easy it is to dig into centuries of family history, which you can do as well by signing up for a 14-day free trial and enjoying all the amazing features MyHeritage has to offer. And just like my recently discovered ancestors most likely, the vast majority of Finns were still farmers, which, together with the trading bourgeoisie, formed the bottom class of society, the bourgeoisie for whom I still don't know an easier word. Above the commoners were the clergy and finally, of course, the nobility. They adopted the over-the-top Baroque fashion, again following European trends, although their influence was smaller in Finland. Laws forbade inter-class marriages, and people's behavior in general reflected their social class. Another European trend of the 1600s copied in Finland, especially in Åland and Bothnia, were witch hunts. Although folk magic was still very common at the time, we know of no more than 100 death sentences from the 1600s. In the spirit of European absolutism, the power of the king and central government were strengthened. This meant that the farmers in the remote corners of the realm had less control of their local decision-making, so their position and standard of living arguably decreased compared to the supposedly dark Middle Ages. Still, some peasants inherited and owned the land which they farmed, and by supplying a mounted soldier for the king's army, they could get tax reliefs and less burden from forcible conscription. It was a real pain for a farm if the working-age men left to fight in distant lands with no guarantee of when or if they would return. Speaking of war, we'll get to that soon. But first, a few words about the Church, which, if you remember, had been turned from Catholic to Lutheran and was controlled by the Crown. Besides its Lutheran religious mission, it was tasked with the job of teaching literacy, which would slowly improve in the country. Education was in general improved with the founding of schools and the Royal Academy of Turku. The strict Lutheran identity was also a convenient weapon against the Orthodox Russians or Catholic Germans and their allies. Which brings us to the raging battlefields of the 30 Years' War, which, for the sake of this video, I will oversimplify as a conflict between Catholics and Protestants. The scale and destruction of the war is hard to comprehend today. It left millions of corpses behind, combined with the resulting diseases. And as its name might suggest to the brightest minds, it lasted 30 long years. Sweden entered the party in 1630, and the Swedish intervention was key in changing the course of the war in favor of the Protestants. The Swedish army was cleverly modernized by Gustav Adolf. As described by Mikko Laakso in the book Hakkapeliitoista korpisotureihin, Adolf's artillery and cavalry were lighter and mobile, and the entire army well coordinated. It was designed to break the formations of the Catholic League fighting in the Spanish and German fashion. Around a third of the army consisted of Finnish troops, who in turn often formed the majority of the cavalry. These horsemen have later achieved somewhat of a legendary status in Finnish history, known for their close-range charges and war cry. While the Finnish farmers formed a large part of the conquering armies, they didn't enjoy the spoils of war, unlike the nobility who had pretty much turned Swedish by this point. And as always, the growth of the kingdom could mean more power and wealth in their pockets. The conflict-ending Peace of Westphalia has often been seen as a starting point for the concept of sovereignty, meaning that other states are not allowed to mess with the affairs of others, which in some twisted way sounds funny to modern ears, as we might take it for granted depending on where we live in the world. Sweden only took part in the 30 Years' War for 5 years, but as so often in history, continued to fight back and forth against the neighboring countries. It could be said that all this fighting left the economy underdeveloped, although some new cities including Oulu, Vaasa and Kokkola were formed around the tar business, Finland's major export. Speaking of exporting, Sweden adopted mercantilist principles. The idea was that there's a limited amount of money and wealth in the world, and more of it has to come into the country than what leaves the country. However, as I've probably said dozens of times now, most people got their livelihoods from farming. And as a country so up north that agriculture was on the verge of being worth it at all, Finland was highly vulnerable to bad weather and crop failures. And bad weather and crop failures indeed occurred for 2 disastrous years in a row in Europe. With the king's focus on wars, a famine swept across the land, leaving piles of corpses behind. Partly due to the mercantilist economy, Food could not be bought even by those who could afford it in the second year of the hunger, as explained by Mirkka Lappalainen in the book Jumalan vihan ruoska. Up to a third of Finland's population died of hunger and the resulting diseases, which makes this one of the worst naturally occurred famines in recorded history, with a scale of devastation directly comparable to the Black Death in the Middle Ages. News of the disaster still traveled rather slowly, and in fact, the state administration thought that people died on purpose in order to avoid paying taxes. Meanwhile, Sweden's enemies had not been idle. By 1699, Denmark, Norway, Russia, Poland and Saxony had formed a powerful but loose alliance, which led them to the Great Northern War, ending the Swedish Empire. Because as history shows us time after time, every empire will fall and every monument crumbles. Actually, that's Empire Falls by Primordial. What a great band. Anyway, as is the case with empires, Sweden too had bitten more land than it could chew, especially with the weakened teeth of a small, famine-ravaged population. Although Sweden saw initial success on the battlefield, their advance towards Moscow was halted. Which sounds familiar to anyone who's into military history. The following Battle of Poltava saw nearly the entire Swedish army captured or annihilated. The following decade, the crumbling Swedish realm was playing defense. Their enemies pushed further into the Swedish-held lands, including the Russian occupation of Finland, which, as you can guess or probably know, was not a great time for Finland. In fact, so strong is the significance of its horrors that we will leave it to the next episode. Do consider subscribing in order not to miss it. And as always, if Finnish mythology and history are close to your heart, see a cardiologist and then check out my other videos. And if you want to discover your ancestors, sign up for a free 14-day trial and enjoy all the amazing features MyHeritage has to offer.